The air at Lake Harrington always carried two scents, pine and danger. Most people only noticed the first, crisp and clean like winter itself. But as Henry Lawson stepped out of his old pickup truck, parked in the long gravel driveway of the Pierce family lodge, the other smell reached him too. A faint metallic note that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with memory. He had smelled it before, long ago, at accident sites where ice had cracked and lives had gone under. The lodge loomed ahead, enormous, its cedar walls glowing orange under the low Arctic sun. A private road curved through snow-dusted trees, leading to a steel gate that opened by remote control. Beyond it stood a world that didn't belong to him, a world of wealth so polished it gleamed cold. Henry pulled his wool collar higher and exhaled a cloud of steam. He wasn't used to places like this anymore. After 35 years in the U.S. Coast Guard's investigative division, he'd retired to Anchorage, living quietly on a small pension, repairing boats, and volunteering with rescue teams. But today wasn't about him. Inside the lodge, laughter rang out, brittle and forced. His daughter, Clara, was somewhere in that noise. He had promised her he'd come for the weekend. "Dad," she'd said on the phone, "Ethan's parents are hosting a family gathering at the Winter Lodge. They'd love for you to come." Her voice had trembled ever so slightly on the word love. Now, standing under the carved wooden arch of the main door, Henry knew that tremor had meant fear. Vera Pierce, Ethan's mother, greeted him with a smile that could slice glass. "Mr. Lawson, you made it. What a drive, I imagine. Come in before you freeze." The foyer looked like something from a luxury magazine. Antler chandeliers, leather armchairs, walls hung with photographs of men in fur coats holding rifles beside the carcasses of bears and elk. It smelled of cedar polish and arrogance. Clara appeared from the dining room, her soft auburn hair tucked behind her ears, cheeks pale from the cold. "Dad!" She hugged him tightly, whispering, "I'm so glad you came." Henry held her a second longer than usual. "You look tired," he said quietly. "I'm fine," she lied with the same forced brightness she used as a teenager when trying to hide bad grades. From across the room, Ethan Pierce raised a glass of bourbon. "Finally, the hero of the family joins us, the man who fights storms for a living." "I used to," Henry corrected. Ethan grinned. "Right, used to. Well, welcome to calm waters then." The others laughed, though nothing was funny. Henry nodded politely and took a seat near the end of the long table. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, showing the frozen lake glimmering like a sheet of silver beyond the glass. Dinner was an elegant trap. The food was perfect, but the conversation had edges. Douglas Pierce, Ethan's father, a broad-shouldered man with a politician's voice, dominated the room. He spoke about hard work and real men, his eyes drifting toward Henry each time he said real. "So, Mr. Lawson," Douglas said, carving into his steak, "you must find retirement dull. After all that excitement at sea, sitting at home must feel like, what's the word, irrelevance." Clara flinched. Henry simply replied, "Peaceful." Douglas chuckled as though the answer proved something. "Peaceful is another word for powerless, don't you think?" The room fell silent for half a second before Ethan broke it with a laugh, clinking glasses. "Dad's just teasing. Don't mind him, Henry." But Henry did mind. Not for himself. He'd been insulted by better men. But because he saw the way Clara's hand trembled as she reached for her wine. He saw how her smile never reached her eyes. He had investigated men like Douglas before. Men who built empires on charm and control. Men who made others small so they could feel big. When dinner ended, the family moved to the lounge where a massive stone fireplace crackled. Douglas poured more whiskey, his voice booming about tomorrow's Pierce family tradition, the Winter Challenge. "It's good old-fashioned fun," he declared. "We go out on the lake, test our courage. The women can watch from the shore." Ethan grinned. "Except Clara, of course. She needs to toughen up. Right, sweetheart?" She laughed weakly. "Maybe next year." Henry's eyes narrowed. "Ice isn't a toy," he said. "The temperatures have been fluctuating all week. That lake isn't safe." Douglas waved a dismissive hand. "We've been walking on that ice since before your Coast Guard even existed." "Then you've been lucky," Henry said. The fire popped sharply, the sound like a gunshot. No one spoke for a while. Later, as the others drifted off to bed, Henry stood alone on the back porch. The night stretched endless, stars glittering over the lake. He could hear the faint groan of ice shifting beneath the snow. It was the sound of pressure, slow, invisible, inevitable. He sipped his coffee and watched the moon's reflection tremble on the frozen surface. Somewhere inside, a voice, old, trained, relentless, whispered that something terrible was about to happen. He was right. The next morning, the world was white. Snow fell in slow, heavy flakes, muting the sounds of the waking forest. The lake stretched out like a sheet of glass, pale blue beneath a layer of thin frost. From the lodge windows, it looked peaceful, beautiful even. But Henry knew better. He stood by the doorway, pulling on his gloves, when he heard Douglas's booming voice. "Rise and shine, people! The Winter Challenge awaits!" Henry turned to see the Pierces filing out with steaming mugs and laughter that echoed too loud for such a quiet morning. Douglas carried a pair of wooden hockey sticks. Ethan had a flask half hidden in his jacket. Vera trailed behind them, wrapped in fur, her lips painted a cruel shade of red. Clara came last, her expression tense. She wore a thick jacket and gloves, the same ones Henry had bought her years ago for a rescue exercise. They were too small now, but she still wore them, maybe out of comfort. "Dad," she whispered as she approached, "just stay close, okay?" "Always," he said softly. They walked down the sloping path toward the lake. Frost crunched beneath their boots. The cold bit through Henry's bones, but he barely felt it. His instincts were louder than the wind, and every step toward the ice screamed danger. Douglas reached the edge first and stomped the surface with a boot. "Solid as granite," he declared proudly. Henry frowned. "You hear that hollow sound? That's not granite. That's air pockets. It's unstable." Douglas waved him off. "You worry too much, Lawson. This lake's been frozen since Christmas." Ethan grinned. "Dad, maybe the Coast Guard's scared of a little ice." The men laughed, loud and mean. Henry said nothing. They walked farther out until the snow thinned, revealing the glassy transparency of the ice beneath. Through it, Henry could see water swirling, dark, restless. He clenched his jaw. "All right, rules are simple," Douglas announced. "We walk to that red flag near the center and back. Whoever turns first buys the next round tonight." Clara's breath clouded the air. "I'll just stay here. It's freezing." Ethan looped an arm around her shoulder. "Oh, come on, sweetheart. You can't let my old man think you're fragile. It's just a short walk." Her eyes darted to her father. Henry gave the smallest shake of his head. But Ethan pressed harder, voice dripping with mock affection. "You always say you want to be part of the family traditions. Well, this is one." "Leave her out of it," Henry said quietly. Ethan turned, his grin fading. "Relax, old man. She's fine." Douglas chuckled. "Let her prove herself. Nothing like a little cold water to wake a person up. "Douglas," Henry warned, "you're drunk. It's not safe." The old man's smile hardened. "I've been walking this ice before you ever learned how to tie a sailor's knot. Now let the girl show some grit." Henry took a step forward, but Ethan's hand pressed against his chest. "Stay out of this." That was when they grabbed her. It happened fast, too fast. Ethan caught her arm while Douglas laughed and reached for the other. Clara gasped, struggling, but they dragged her forward onto the lake. "Ethan!" "Stop!" Henry shouted, his voice slicing through the wind. "You'll kill her!" "Relax," Ethan said. "We're just teasing." They reached the middle. Clara stumbled, her boots slipping. "Please, stop." "Go on," Douglas taunted. "You said you wanted to be part of the family. Let's see if you can handle a little cold." Then the sound came, sharp, distinct, unforgettable. A crack. It rippled across the lake like thunder. "Dad!" Clara screamed. Her voice was high, panicked. Before Henry could move, the ice splintered beneath her feet. She fell with a short, terrified cry and vanished. "Clara!" Henry's body moved before thought. He sprinted toward the hole, boots sliding, wind clawing at his face. He saw her red scarf flutter on the surface, then sink into the black. Ethan stood frozen. Douglas laughed nervously. "She'll pop right up. The girl can swim." Henry reached them and shoved Ethan aside so hard the man stumbled onto the snow. "You idiots!" he roared. He dropped to his knees, scraping at the jagged edges. The cold burned through his gloves. "Clara! Clara!" Nothing, just dark water. Then movement, a pale flash beneath the surface. Her hand. Henry's training took over. He flung himself flat to spread his weight and smashed the ice with his elbow until it cracked wide enough. The freezing water swallowed him. It was like diving into knives. Every nerve screamed, but he kept going, eyes open despite the pain. He saw her just below, hair floating like seaweed, eyes half open. He grabbed her jacket collar and kicked upward, lungs on fire. He broke through, gasping, dragging her onto the surface. Her face was ghostly white, a trickle of blood running from her temple. "She hit her head!" Henry shouted. "Call 911!" Ethan stared blankly. "She's fine, you're overreacting." Douglas smirked. "You're making a scene, Lawson." Henry's voice cracked with fury. "She's dying." They just turned away. "We'll be at the lodge," Douglas muttered. "When she wakes up, tell her to stop being dramatic." The SUV engine roared seconds later, fading into the snowy distance. Henry was left alone on the ice, kneeling beside his unconscious daughter. The cold bit through his soaked jacket, but he didn't care. He pressed her chest, breathed into her lungs, again and again, whispering, "Come on, baby, come on." At last, she coughed, a weak, shuddering breath. Henry's vision blurred with tears, half freezing on his lashes. He pulled her close and looked around desperately. A faint hum reached him, the distant buzz of a snowmobile. A fisherman appeared on the far shore, waving frantically when he saw Henry's arm signal. Within minutes, the stranger arrived. He helped lift Clara onto the sled, wrapping her in thermal blankets. "I'll get her to the ranger station. There's a radio there." Henry nodded, his body trembling violently. "Go, I'll follow." He watched the snowmobile vanish into the storm, carrying the last of his family, the only part that mattered. The wind howled across the frozen lake, blowing over the footprints, erasing every trace of what had just happened. But not in Henry's mind. Never there. He stood alone in the storm, soaked, shaking, staring into the dark hole in the ice. The water rippled once, then froze over again, thin, perfect, silent. That was when Henry Lawson made his first decision. Not to forgive, not to call the police, but to make a call of his own. The hospital lights in Fairbanks flickered as the generator kicked in against the wind. Outside, the storm raged like a beast, but inside, everything was still. Too still. Henry sat in a plastic chair near the emergency ward doors, his clothes stiff with frozen water, his hands raw and cracked. The nurse had offered him a blanket, but he'd refused. The cold helped him think. It kept the anger sharp. Clara lay behind a glass panel, wrapped in warming blankets, a breathing tube fixed under her nose. Her skin was pale as porcelain. Every few seconds, the monitor beeped, a thin, fragile sound holding back the silence of death. He watched the green line move and thought of the men who laughed as she sank beneath the ice. He could still hear them, their careless, arrogant voices. "She can swim, old man." He clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. A doctor entered the hallway, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Lawson," she said gently, "we've stabilized her temperature, but she suffered a concussion and severe hypothermia. We'll need to monitor her brain activity overnight." "She'll make it," Henry said. It wasn't a question. The doctor hesitated. "We'll do everything we can." When she walked away, Henry finally exhaled, his breath fogged in the cold air. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his old satellite phone, the one he hadn't touched in years. Its screen was scratched, but it still worked. He scrolled through contacts until he found a name he hadn't seen in almost a decade. Jack Morrison. Henry hesitated only a second before pressing call. The signal crackled, static blending with the howl of the wind outside. "Yeah?" A gravelly voice answered, half asleep, half wary. "Jack, it's Henry." Silence. Then the rustle of sheets, a click of a lamp. "Lawson? Jesus, I thought you were dead." "I might as well be," Henry said, his voice low. "They hurt my girl." The tone on the other end shifted instantly. No more sleep, no small talk. "Who?" "The Pierces, her husband and his family. They pushed her into the lake, laughed while she went under." Static filled the line. Then Jack's voice came back, slow and deliberate. "Where are they now?" "On their way back to Juneau, probably drinking to celebrate." Another pause. Henry could almost hear the gears turning in his old partner's mind. Jack Morrison had been his shadow for 20 years in the Coast Guard's investigative unit. A man who knew every dark corner of Alaska's political web. He was reckless, brilliant, and dangerous when provoked. Henry had cut ties after Jack crossed a line during a corruption case, leaking classified documents to expose a senator. It had destroyed his career. But right now, Henry didn't care about rules. "They think this will blow over," Henry continued. "They think they can buy silence like they always have." Jack's tone dropped an octave. "What do you want me to do?" Henry's fingers tightened around the phone. He looked through the glass at Clara, unconscious but breathing. Her chest rose and fell in rhythm with the monitors. "I want them to feel the cold," Henry said softly. "I want them to remember her scream every time they close their eyes." There was a faint sound on the other end, a match striking. Jack was lighting one of his endless cigarettes. "You sure about this, partner?" he asked. "Once we start, there's no going back." Henry didn't hesitate. "I'm sure." A long exhale of smoke crackled through the static. "All right, Henry. I'll dig. The Pierces always smelled like old oil and dirt money. Let's see what's buried under their ice." Henry's hand trembled, Not from fear, but release. The plan had no words yet, but it was forming between them like frost spreading across glass. "Jack," he said quietly, "they're heading home now." "Then consider the storm moving south," Jack replied. Henry ended the call and lowered the phone into his lap. The storm outside pounded against the windows, shaking them in their frames. It sounded like a heartbeat, steady, unstoppable. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching the snow swirl outside the hospital glass. For the first time since the accident, he didn't feel helpless. He felt cold, clear, and calm. The kind of calm a man feels before he pulls the trigger. Jack Morrison didn't sleep that night. He never did when his instincts told him something big was stirring beneath the surface. Outside his cabin in Homer, the wind rattled the tin roof, snow curling around the corners of the windows like ghostly fingers. Inside, cigarette smoke twisted through the glow of a single desk lamp. On the table lay a laptop covered in scratches, an old police scanner, and a stack of folders marked Pierce Logistics Limited. Jack had started digging the moment Henry's call ended. He knew that name. Everyone in Alaska's industrial circles did. The Pierces were oil shipping royalty. Money, power, and corruption all polished into one family name. But what Jack was seeing wasn't new wealth. It was old rot. He typed fast, cross-referencing old Coast Guard reports and environmental claims from the late 1980s. Then he found it. A single paragraph buried deep in an archived article from the Anchorage Daily. Engineer Mark Leland presumed drowned after accident on Lake Harrington during routine pipeline maintenance. Body not recovered. No foul play suspected. Jack frowned. Lake Harrington again. The same lake where Clara nearly died. He pushed back from the table, reached for his coat, and grabbed the keys to his snowmobile. 2 hours later, he was sliding through the icy dawn toward Valdez, where an old friend still owed him a favor. The drive was long and brutal. Frost bit his face through the helmet, but he didn't slow down. By noon, he pulled up outside a rundown cabin half buried in snow. A faded sign on the porch read, "Sheriff's Office, Retired." Jack knocked. A man in his 70s opened the door, wearing suspenders and holding a mug of black coffee. His gray hair stood in tufts, and his eyes, though weary, were sharp. "Jack Morrison?" the man said. "Hell, son, I thought they banned you from every station north of Seattle." "They tried," Jack said, brushing off snow. "Mind if I come in, Ron?" Ron Briggs, former county sheriff, shrugged and stepped aside. "I figured you'd show up again one day. What's this about?" Jack set his recorder on the table. 1989, the Leland case. You were the lead investigator." The old sheriff's jaw tightened. "That was a long time ago. I don't talk about it." Jack's voice softened. "I'm not here to ruin you, Ron. But another person nearly drowned in the same lake last week. The same families involved." Ron stared into his mug. For a long moment, only the wind filled the silence. Then he said quietly, "I knew it would come back." He reached for a drawer and pulled out a thin, weathered folder bound with a rubber band. "I kept this when I retired," he said. "Couldn't bring myself to burn it." Inside were 3 photographs, grainy, faded. One showed the frozen lake, another, a half-submerged snowmobile. The last was a man in a heavy coat standing beside it, face half hidden by shadows. "That's Douglas Pierce," Jack said. Ron nodded. "He was there the day Leland went missing. Claimed the man fell through a weak patch in the ice during an inspection. Said he tried to save him, but it was too late." Jack flipped through the report. "But the autopsy, there wasn't one, was there?" There was no body to autopsy, Ron said bitterly. Never recovered. That's how they wanted it. 2 days later, Pierce settled with Leland's family. Big payout, under the table. Case closed. Who closed it? Ron hesitated, then met Jack's eyes. I did, but not because I wanted to. He took a deep breath. They showed me pictures of my boy. He was in college back then. They said accidents happened fast up here. A week later, I signed the report and buried the file. Jack felt a cold weight settle in his chest. How much did they pay you, Ron? The sheriff looked ashamed. Enough to keep my son safe. Not enough to keep my soul clean. Jack turned off the recorder and stood. You've kept this guilt long enough. Let me take it from here. As Jack left the cabin, Ron called after him. Morrison, be careful. The Pierces don't threaten twice. Jack smiled grimly. Neither do I. By the time he returned to Homer, the sun had dipped behind the mountains. He poured a cup of coffee, turned on his laptop, and began uploading everything he'd gathered. The report, photos, dates, names. He knew the right people to contact: environmental watchdogs, independent journalists, and 2 ex-prosecutors who owed him favors. But before he hit send, he made one last call. Henry answered on the first ring. Talk to me. Jack's voice was steady but cold. You were right. The Pierces have blood in that lake, older than Clara's. A man named Mark Leland, engineer, whistleblower. He planned to expose Pierce Logistics for falsifying safety reports on oil transport. He disappeared right after that. Your daughter fell into the same water. Henry's voice was quiet, too quiet. Who else knows? No one who matters yet, Jack said. But that's about to change. I've got the report, the sheriff's confession, and financial transfers linking Pierce to hush money. The kind of thing that makes powerful men panic. Send it, Henry said. Jack hesitated. You understand what that means, right? Once this goes out, they'll know who's behind it. They'll come after both of us. Henry looked through the hospital window. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the snow in gold and crimson. Inside the room, Clara slept peacefully for the first time. I've been hunted before, he said. But this time, I'm not running. Jack exhaled smoke into the phone. All right then, you'll have your justice, the kind that burns slow. He hung up and pressed send. Within minutes, copies of the files began spreading through encrypted servers. The truth had left his hands. It was now unstoppable. Back in Fairbanks, Henry turned off his phone and sat beside Clara. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Sleep, baby, he whispered. The ice won't hold them much longer. Outside, the wind shifted direction. The storm that had carried her toward death was now carrying something else. Retribution. And somewhere deep under the frozen surface of Lake Harrington, the ice cracked again. Not from the weather this time, but from the weight of secrets rising to the surface. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and melting snow. 2 days had passed since Clara had been moved out of intensive care, and the color was finally starting to return to her face. She still slept most of the time, drifting in and out, her body healing slowly from the deep cold that had nearly claimed her. Henry sat beside her bed, reading an old Coast Guard manual, though he wasn't truly reading it. He just needed something to do with his hands. Each time the wind howled against the window, he looked up, half expecting to see the black SUV parked outside, headlights cutting through the snow. But the lot remained empty. At noon, a nurse wheeled in a large arrangement of flowers. White lilies, so many that the small room suddenly filled with their heavy, sweet scent. Henry's stomach tightened. He hadn't ordered anything. "Delivery for Ms. Clara Pierce," the nurse said cheerfully. No sender listed, but it came with a note. She set the vase on the table and handed Henry a small envelope. He took it carefully. His name wasn't on it, but something about the perfect handwriting on the front, elegant, expensive ink, told him exactly who had sent it. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single line written in gold ink. "Don't dramatize, old man. She just slipped." Henry read it twice and then folded the note precisely in half and slid it back into the envelope. His pulse didn't spike. His expression didn't change. He'd seen worse things written on official reports, words that erased truth and replaced it with comfort. But something about this note, this deliberate cruelty, hit him deeper than bullets ever could. He stood up, walked to the trash bin, and dropped the entire bouquet inside. The nurse gasped. "Sir, those are—" "She's allergic," Henry said evenly. The nurse blinked. "To lilies?" "Yes," he said. "Very." He didn't explain. She nodded awkwardly and left, shutting the door behind her. Henry sat again, looking at the snow swirling outside. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. One message waited unsent in drafts, typed the night before, when Jack's new evidence had arrived. He read it once more. "To Jack Morrison, Stage 1. His thumb hovered over send for several seconds before pressing it. A minute later, his phone buzzed with a single reply. "Understood." Henry looked at Clara. She stirred in her sleep, mumbling softly, her lips pale but alive. Her bandaged hand twitched toward his. He took it gently, feeling the faint warmth there. "I'm right here," he whispered. "You rest." He stayed that way for hours, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing, the beep of the monitors, the hum of the heating vents. Beneath it all, he felt something new, a stillness that wasn't peace. It was precision, the calm before controlled detonation. By evening, the hospital hallway grew quieter. Nurses traded shifts. Snowplows passed in the distance. Henry stepped into the corridor to get coffee from the vending machine, and when he returned, he saw something that made his blood freeze. The bouquet was gone. So was the note. He walked out again, scanning the hallway. Nothing unusual, just the janitor's cart and the echo of squeaking wheels. But on the floor near the elevator doors, a small gold foil card glimmered under the fluorescent light. Henry bent to pick it up. It was identical to the one that had come with the lilies, except blank. On the back, someone had written in pencil, "You should have stayed retired." He slid it into his pocket and went back inside, locking the door behind him. Clara was still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the dark message her father had just received. Henry sat down, rested his hands on his knees, and let the silence swallow the room. He had dealt with intimidation before. Threats, warnings, half-spoken promises of violence. It was the language of corrupt men. But these people had made one mistake too many. They had made it personal. He picked up his phone again and opened the secure folder Jack had sent earlier that day. Inside were scanned documents, bank transfers, property deeds, and a decades-old photograph of Douglas Pierce standing beside an oil barge. The caption read, "Day after the Harrington incident." Henry studied the image for a long time. Then he murmured to himself, "You left footprints, Doug, and snow remembers." He closed the phone, leaned back, and exhaled slowly. His rage was no longer fire. It was ice. That night, he didn't sleep. He simply sat and watched over his daughter, waiting for morning. When dawn finally came, the sun spilled pale light through the frost-covered window. Clara stirred, whispering softly, "Dad?" "I'm here," he said. Her eyelids fluttered open, and for the first time she saw his face clearly. "Did he call?" she asked weakly. "Who?" "Ethan," she said, voice trembling. Henry paused. "He sent flowers." Clara blinked, confusion giving way to slow understanding. Her lips parted, and a tear rolled down her cheek. "He never changes," she whispered. "No," Henry said quietly, but everything else just did. He turned to the window, watching the snow fall over Fairbanks. Somewhere out there, Jack Morrison was already moving, digging through old lies, shaking buried bones. The Pierces had opened the game. Now it was Henry's turn to play. The blizzard outside Homer had calmed into a white silence. For most of Alaska, that meant peace. For Jack Morrison, it meant perfect cover. He sat at his desk, surrounded by the humming of servers and the soft crackle of a space heater. On his screen glowed a headline draft that would soon ignite a storm across the state. The Frozen Truth: How an Oil Empire Buried a Whistleblower and Tried Again 30 Years Later. Underneath, he'd attached the photos, reports, and confessions he'd gathered. Before dawn, he scheduled it to go live on 3 independent news sites. Then he leaned back, took a slow drag from his cigarette, and muttered, "Stage 1 complete." Within hours, the internet began to tremble. By mid-morning, radio anchors in Juneau were already discussing the article, their voices urgent. Anonymous sources have revealed shocking new evidence linking Douglas Pierce, CEO of Pierce Logistics, to the mysterious 1989 drowning of engineer Mark Leland. By noon, every local station had picked it up. The story spread faster than wildfire in dry brush. In Fairbanks, Henry stood by the hospital window watching the snow melt from the glass. He could see nurses whispering in the hallway, their phones buzzing with the same story. The headline flashed briefly on the television in the waiting area. He saw Pierce's face there, older, heavier, confident no more. Clara was sitting up in bed now, her voice soft but stronger. "Dad, did you do this?" Henry turned toward her. "Do what?" "The story," she said. "Everyone's talking about it. Ethan's father. He's all over the news. They're saying he killed someone." He said nothing for a moment, then walked over and adjusted her blanket. "Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, sweetheart." Clara's eyes glistened. "They'll come after you." Henry smiled faintly. "They already did." He reached into his pocket and showed her the gold foil card. Her lips parted in disbelief. "Then why aren't you scared?" she whispered. He looked out at the falling snow. "Because I'm not the one trapped under ice anymore." In Juneau, chaos erupted inside the Pierce mansion. Douglas Pierce's phone rang nonstop. Reporters, lawyers, shareholders. His empire, built on secrets, was crumbling in real time. Every call he answered made it worse. Investors froze accounts. The board demanded explanations. His wife, Vera, was pacing the marble foyer, her voice shaking. "Douglas, this will ruin us!" He slammed his fist against the bar counter. "It's lies! That damned journalist! Someone fed him this garbage!" Ethan entered, pale and hungover, his phone in hand. "Dad, they're showing the sheriff's confession online. There's even audio." Douglas grabbed the device. A trembling voice filled the air. "They showed me pictures of my boy. Said accidents happened fast up here. A week later, I signed the report and buried the file. Douglas froze. The recording was real, unmistakable. He hurled the phone across the room. It shattered against the wall. "Who did this?" Ethan demanded. "Who's behind it?" Douglas turned toward him, his face red with fury. "Your wife's father, that old bastard." Ethan blinked. "Henry? He's just a washed-up Coast Guard officer." Douglas's eyes burned. "He's not washed up. He's methodical. He called someone who knows how to hurt men like me." He stalked to his desk and pressed a hidden button under the drawer. A small panel slid open, revealing a burner phone. He dialed a number from memory. When a man's voice answered, Douglas spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "Find Jack Morrison. He's somewhere in Alaska. Make sure he forgets my name." Jack expected them. That evening, he sat in a cabin near Anchor Point with his laptop closed and a revolver resting beside his coffee mug. Snow muffled every sound outside. He'd planted the bait hours ago, a fake address embedded in the metadata of his article. If Douglas's people traced him, they'd find it. Around midnight, headlights sliced through the forest. 2 black SUVs stopped at the edge of the clearing. 4 men stepped out, moving with military precision. Jack watched from the dark window, calm as a man waiting for a train. He picked up the revolver but didn't aim it. He didn't need to. At that exact moment, a camera hidden in the porch light transmitted everything to a cloud server. Their faces, the license plates, the guns. He smiled and whispered, "Smile for the camera, boys." When the men broke down the cabin door, they found nothing but empty furniture and a flickering monitor displaying one line of text. "Nice try. Say hi to the world." An hour later, security footage from the break-in appeared online alongside the article, proving Pierce's men had tried to silence the journalist. The backlash was instant. What had been scandal now became criminal investigation. Federal agents raided the Pierce estate before dawn. Back in Fairbanks, Henry watched it unfold on live television. Douglas Pierce, handcuffed, his expensive coat dusted with snow, being led down the mansion steps while reporters shouted questions. Ethan trailed behind him, face blank, flanked by FBI agents. Clara woke to the sound of the TV. Her voice trembled. "Dad, it's over?" Henry didn't answer right away. He walked to the window, staring at the gray morning sky. "Not yet," he said softly. "Justice doesn't move that fast. But it started." He turned to her. "You need to rest. We'll be leaving soon." "Leaving?" she asked. He nodded. "You've got nothing left in this town but ghosts." Clara's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness but release. "Where will we go?" He smiled faintly. "Somewhere the water isn't frozen." That night, Jack called from an unlisted number. "It's done, Henry. They took the bait, and now the Bureau has everything. Bribes, murder, intimidation, even the assault on Clara. You'll see it on the evening news." Henry closed his eyes, listening to the soft hum of the hospital's heater. "You sure you're safe?" Jack chuckled. "I was born hiding in the snow, remember? You just focus on your girl. I'll take care of the rest." Henry thanked him quietly and ended the call. He sat beside Clara again, watching her sleep. For the first time in days, her breathing was steady, peaceful. Outside, the snow finally stopped falling. The sky cleared enough to show the northern lights rippling above the horizon. A curtain of green and blue, shimmering like life reborn. Henry stood at the window and whispered to the frozen night, "You buried a man under this ice, Douglas. But the lake remembers every name it swallows." The wind answered softly, carrying away the last of the storm. And somewhere in the depths of Lake Harrington, the silence that had lasted 30 years finally cracked open, for good. Morning sunlight broke over Alaska like a blade, cold and merciless. The storm had passed, leaving the world eerily quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Across the state, the name Pierce no longer carried wealth or power. It carried scandal, guilt, and the unmistakable stench of fear. News vans clogged the streets of Juneau. Helicopters hovered above the estate. Headlines rolled across every television in Anchorage, Fairbanks, and beyond. Oil tycoon Douglas Pierce arrested in connection to 1989 murder cover-up. Pierce Logistics stock plummets 62% overnight. Whistleblower case reopened after viral investigation. Reporters shouted questions as FBI agents led Douglas down the steps of his mansion. His once perfect hair was disheveled. His hands were bound in steel. For the first time, the man who thought himself untouchable looked small. "Mr. Pierce, did you kill Mark Leland? Did you pay to cover it up? Was your daughter-in-law's accident connected to your past crimes?" Douglas didn't answer. He kept his head low, jaw clenched, but his eyes darted wildly as if searching for a way out of this new, merciless light. Inside the mansion, chaos reigned. Vera Pierce, pale and trembling, sat on the marble stairs surrounded by shattered glass and overturned champagne flutes. Ethan stood near the window, staring at the police cars flashing red and blue across the snow. "They can't prove anything," he muttered. "They don't have evidence on me." Vera's voice was a whisper. "You think they care about proof now? The world's already decided. You pushed her, Ethan. They're calling it attempted murder." Ethan spun toward her. "It was a joke. She fell." His mother's expression hardened. "And your father said the same thing 30 years ago." That same morning, Henry sat in the hospital cafeteria, hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee gone cold. The TV above the counter showed the arrest live. The volume was low, but he didn't need the sound. He'd spent his life reading people's faces, and Douglas's expression told him everything, arrogance cracking into terror. Jack's voice buzzed through his phone's speaker. "Federal prosecutors are digging through Pierce Logistics' offshore accounts now. It's worse than I thought. He's been laundering money for decades. Contracts tied to bribed officials, oil permits, even falsified safety reports." Henry sipped his coffee. "And Ethan?" "Facing attempted manslaughter. They'll try to spin it as an accident, but the security footage from the lodge says otherwise." Henry froze. "Footage?" Jack chuckled darkly. "Turns out, that fancy mansion of theirs has a private surveillance system. Guess who hacked it last night?" Henry couldn't help a small smile. "You always were the best with locks." "Don't thank me yet," Jack said. "The Pierces aren't finished. Douglas will fight tooth and nail. Men like him don't plead guilty. They drag everyone down with them." Henry leaned back. "Let him drag. He'll find nothing to hold on to." By afternoon, the fall spread beyond Alaska. National networks picked up the story. Former employees came forward with testimonies. The Department of Justice confirmed an official reopening of the Leland case. Every hour brought a new revelation: secret bank accounts, falsified safety audits, bribed senators. The once mighty Pierce dynasty had collapsed in less than 48 hours. Douglas sat in an interrogation room, the hum of fluorescent lights above him. His lawyer, sweating through his expensive suit, whispered frantically about plea bargains, but Douglas wasn't listening. He was staring at the folder the agent had placed before him: photos, letters, signed transfers. But what broke him wasn't the paperwork. It was the last photo at the bottom. Clara in a hospital bed, pale and broken, her father sitting beside her. "Your family's victims keep surviving, Mr. Pierce," said Special Agent Carver. "That's something you can't buy your way out of." Douglas said nothing. His lips trembled once before he leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "You don't understand, Agent," he said quietly. "Men like me built this state." Carver closed the folder. "No, men like you buried it." At the same time in Fairbanks, Clara stood near her hospital window, watching light dance off the snow. She was stronger now, walking without assistance, her hair brushed, her face calm. She turned to her father, who sat reading a newspaper he wasn't really reading. "It feels strange," she said softly, "seeing him on TV like that. The man who made me feel so small." Henry looked up. "He's smaller now." She smiled faintly. "And Ethan? They'll deal with him too. You won't have to see him again." She nodded, silent for a long while. Then she whispered, "I used to think he loved me, Dad. I kept trying to make him proud, to be perfect enough for him." Henry folded the paper. "Evil doesn't look like a monster at first. It looks like someone who says they love you while they teach you to fear." Clara looked at him, tears shining in her eyes. "Did you ever feel like you failed me?" He hesitated. "Every day. Until now." She walked over, took his hand, and squeezed it. "You didn't fail me. You saved me." That evening, the two of them left the hospital together. The air outside was crisp and still, the last blush of sunset painting the horizon. Henry helped Clara into his truck, then climbed in beside her. For a long time they didn't speak. Finally, she broke the silence. "What happens now?" Henry started the engine. "Now, we rebuild. Slowly, quietly." As they drove through the snow-covered streets, the radio played a breaking update. "Sources confirm that Douglas Pierce has agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for leniency. His son Ethan Pierce remains in custody facing multiple charges." Henry reached over and turned the radio off. "Enough noise," he murmured. The road wound north, away from the city, toward open country. The sky above shimmered with faint green light. Clara leaned her head on the window, eyes half closed. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Henry smiled. "It always was. You just had to survive long enough to see it again." Behind them, in the city, reporters still shouted and headlines still spun. But out here, the air was clean. The snow fell softly on the dark pines. And for the first time in years, Henry Lawson felt something he hadn't dared to feel since before the ice broke. Peace. He didn't need revenge anymore. The truth had done the work for him. But deep inside, as he looked at the road stretching endlessly ahead, he promised himself one final thing. If any shadow of the Pierces ever crawled out of that lake again, he'd be waiting. The ferry from Whittier to Kodiak cut through the gray sea like a slow heartbeat. The wind was sharp, smelling of salt and cold metal. Henry stood on the deck, hands resting on the railing, watching the waves crash against the hull. Every sound of the water brought him a strange comfort, the rhythm of something honest, something that never lied. Clara sat inside by the window, bundled in a thick wool coat, sketching quietly in a small notebook. Her color had returned. Her eyes no longer carried the hollow reflection of trauma. She still had scars, inside and out, but they were no longer open wounds. They were maps of survival. When the island came into view, Henry smiled faintly. Kodiak wasn't much, A scattering of homes along the bay, fishing boats rocking at the docks, snow-dusted roofs. But to him it was paradise, a place without the noise of wealth, power, or deceit. The two rented a small, weather-beaten house near the shore. The windows rattled when the wind rose, and the wood floors creaked underfoot. But the first night, Clara stood in the doorway of her new room and whispered, "It feels alive." Henry nodded. "That's because it's honest. Everything here has survived a storm or two." In the mornings, Henry repaired a small boat he'd bought for cheap from an old fisherman. It was chipped and faded, but the motor still hummed. He painted the name on the side in steady letters. Second Wind. When Clara saw it, she laughed softly. "You always name things after storms." He shrugged. "Storms tell you who you really are." By the second week, they'd fallen into a rhythm. Clara helped at the harbor's rescue station, training volunteers on first aid and safety drills. Henry assisted with navigation classes for young fishermen, passing down the kind of knowledge that didn't come from books, but from years of near misses and frozen nights at sea. Some evenings, they sat together on the dock, eating simple meals of fish stew and bread, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The water shimmered gold, and the gulls drifted lazily overhead. Clara leaned against him one evening and asked quietly, "Do you ever regret it? Everything that happened?" Henry thought for a long time before answering. "Regret's a strange thing. It sneaks up on you, even when you win. But no, what I regret is not acting sooner. Letting people like them believe kindness is weakness." She nodded, her gaze following the horizon. "You didn't destroy them, though. The truth did." He smiled. "That's how it's supposed to work. I just cleared the ice." The radio on the table beside them crackled faintly with distant news. Douglas Pierce had pleaded guilty to obstruction, fraud, and conspiracy. Ethan was awaiting sentencing for attempted manslaughter. The once mighty Pierce empire was dissolving under a mountain of lawsuits. But Henry didn't listen anymore. He turned the volume down and watched the waves. "Justice doesn't need an audience," he murmured. As spring crept slowly into Alaska, the snow melted from the roofs and green crept back into the hills. The lake where Clara had nearly died thawed completely. A local paper ran a story about a team of divers who found fragments of old machinery near its bottom, relics of the forgotten oil project that had started it all. Henry read it once, then folded the paper and tossed it into the fire. Some ghosts didn't need burial. They just needed to melt. On the first truly warm day of May, Clara stood at the dock holding a small wooden plaque she had carved by hand. She nailed it to the side of the boathouse. It read, "Pierce Lake Rescue Center, in honor of those who survived the cold." Henry placed a hand on her shoulder, pride softening his eyes. "You turned a wound into something good." She smiled. "You taught me that." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they took the second wind out into open water. The sea was calm, and the air carried no weight of memory, only salt, wind, and peace. Clara stood at the bow, hair whipping in the breeze, laughter spilling into the open air. Henry steered from behind, his old hands steady on the wheel. For a moment, he thought of the frozen lake, the darkness beneath, the years of silence that had once bound him. Then he looked forward again. The waves parted cleanly before them, and for the first time in decades, Henry Lawson felt truly free. Weeks passed on the island, and the rhythm of the tides became the rhythm of their lives. Henry rose with the dawn, brewed coffee in the small metal pot that hissed and sputtered, and sat on the porch listening to the sea. Clara joined him later, wrapped in a blanket, her sketchbook resting on her knees. One morning, she asked softly, "Do you think people like them ever understand what they've done?" Henry gazed out toward the mist rolling over the waves. "People like Douglas Pierce don't understand until they lose everything. Even then, it's not guilt they feel, it's absence. They grieve the fall, not the cause." She thought about that, then whispered, "Then what was this all for?" He smiled faintly. "For truth, for peace, for the simple right to wake up without fear. You don't fight monsters to become one. You fight them so your soul can breathe again." Silence followed, the kind that was not empty, but full of meaning, of shared survival. Clara leaned against him, and for a long while they just watched the morning light play on the water. The scars that once defined her now looked like proof that she had lived, not that she had been broken. Later that afternoon, they went down to the docks, where Henry helped a group of teenagers mend torn nets. Clara handed out warm drinks, laughing easily. The sound of her laughter, real, unforced, moved Henry more than any victory ever could. He realized then that revenge hadn't given him peace. What did was this: seeing his daughter alive, whole, and free from those who had tried to drown her light. That night, under a sky filled with stars so sharp they seemed to hum, Henry stood outside their little house. He looked up and whispered a quiet prayer, not for vengeance or justice this time, but for gratitude. Gratitude that the lake had given his daughter back. Gratitude that truth had surfaced at last. Gratitude that some storms end not with thunder, but with calm. When he went inside, Clara was asleep on the couch, a blanket over her, the fireplace glowing softly. He looked at her, then at the flicker of light dancing across the walls, and thought of a line his brother Jack once told him: "Revenge is for the moment. Truth is forever." Henry smiled. "You were right, brother," he murmured. "The truth melts even the coldest ice." He closed the door gently, the sea murmuring beyond the window, a lullaby of peace after decades of storm. And with that, the story of Henry Lawson, the father who fought the cold, came to rest. Not with noise, but with quiet, and with light.